Good evening, campers, dreamers, and babysitters. And yes, we are here with our review for Peter Pan's Neverland Nightmare. This is very exciting for us, something we've been waiting to talk about a little bit more for quite some time. I did do a video where I broke down some of the things I wanted folks to be aware of, as well as Luke and I sat down with the director himself, Scott Chambers, to discuss Peter Pan and all things Neverland Nightmares. Very, very fun conversation, if I do say so myself. Luke, how you feeling about all that?
Oh, Scott's always a good time. He's someone that you can tell is such a horror fan and just wants to make horror movies that he doesn't get a big head at all, and certainly when you look at Blood and Honey and where that started and kind of what it's opening with the floodgates, I think in terms of that public domain horror, I guess is what they're deeming it, kind of really being that tentpole and really kind of starting the ball rolling with that. I think it's easy to kind of maybe lose touch and say, I'm better than you, or, I really started this, but he's always willing to help. I mean, we've sat down even off camera and talked to him. I think after that interview, we kind of just sat there and talked to him for a really long time afterward. And to really pick his brain, he's just someone that is so easygoing and so willing to help. It's so hard not to like him.
Yeah, definitely. And that's just, I think a plus and a piece that we get to witness just being, rather close friends with him at this point. As well as we did, like I said in that video, get to see a very early cut of this film. So we actually saw this before it had all the effects done and everything in it, which was a super huge privilege. We always appreciate somebody asking for our input. I mean, it's crazy to think that would ever happen with somebody actually making something that's going to be popping up in theaters. And I gotta say, it was even wilder to sit down and actually see the finished version, to see everything with all the effects, with all of the, characters having all their abilities and all the stuff they're supposed to have at this point. And yeah, I gotta say, walking out of Peter Pan Neverland Nightmare, I was a big fan of, the film when I first saw it. Obviously, you get a little bit of those jitters when it comes to just, wow, I'm seeing something before it's even like being screened to anybody yet. So, you got to kind of let that sit. You got to let that kind of step back. I did have some issues with it, and I think we both did. We sent a long list of notes to Scott that he was looking for. And I was surprised to not only see so many of those notes actually make it into the final section of the film and then be so receptive of it, but to actually see everything work with all the finalized effects, with all the music, everything. It was really, really nice to see just how cemented and different this tale is from the things we've seen from this team prior, specifically Blood and Honey and Blood and Honey 2.
Yeah, such a way different tone than I think what we're used to with Blood and Honey, and it's funny to get that peek behind the curtain and see this thing, before anyone else did, before all of the bells and whistles, all the effects have been put together. And to really see this, it's such an odd experience to be able to see that first product and then see the finished product of it, because, we really kind of focused on that story because it was like, yeah, this is putting in post. We'll get to this, we'll get to that, and really did focus on that story. And from that first initial viewing to this viewing, I'll say the story is just so dark. It's so twisted that I absolutely love it. I think, when you look at Blood and Honey and you kind of know what to expect, a lot of people weren't happy with that first one. That second one came out swinging and really did offer something different, unique storytelling. And this one, Neverland Nightmares, easily offers something different. This gets even darker than what we're used to seeing. And it really does cover a lot of ground. I think there's some things in here that, people may, as a filmmaker, as a creative, may say, maybe second guess themselves and say, I don't know if I should be doing this. Maybe, we'll pull our punches a little bit. But Scott, he absolutely goes for it. He wanted to tell a very unique story, and that is what we get with Neverland Nightmares.
I agree. And, I think that's going to be the biggest thing for a lot of people walking into this, and why I wanted to make that little video, not only to give the audience a little something more to chew on than just an interview, because as if you've been making content on YouTube, that unless you're a giant outlet and you're putting interviews out, YouTube doesn't really know what to do with them. So it was kind of like, a happy medium there where I got to talk about some of the things that I really loved. And I guess like going into it a little bit more before I go into some of my criticisms, I did just want to say that I think that the thing that this movie does so well is that it's an origin story. This feels very much like we're watching a villain kind of come to fruition throughout this film. Now, he's already very much established as the movie like begins, and he's got his thing going on, but we get to see kind of a little bit more into his psyche, why he is the way he is, just a tad, just enough to really lay that groundwork and say like, okay, this is what's going on with Peter Pan. Here's all the basics of it. But you can really see the clear notion of just he's going to be a much bigger, much darker force going forward into things like the Poohniverse, which is coming out in just like a year or two.
Yeah, and when we had that initial viewing, it's been a little bit since, we got to check this out again, and then kind of going into this, where we have everything laid out in front of us. After that couple months, I had forgotten how dark this film was and how dark Peter Pan is in this, And Scott did such an amazing job intertwining that kind of Peter Pan lore in such an organic way into more of a modern story where, sometimes when you are trying to pay tributes or pull from established lore into a horror story, sometimes it doesn't feel as authentic, where it's kind of a little bit eye roll. It's like they just put that in there to kind of, go with the flow of Peter Pan or whatever the story is being told. But what you take from Neverland Nightmares is that Scott really didn't force anything. I didn't feel throughout this entire story where it's like, if it didn't work, it didn't work. But if I found a way to put a dark twist on something, Scott easily did it here. And it feels like a modern story. So, I think people need to be prepared for how dark this is. I think a lot of people, we've talked about it. It's certainly going around the horror space of, it feels like the Black Phone. I will say it's got similarities to the Black Phone without, for me, ever really like pulling blatantly from the Black Phone. It really does have its own unique voice where it's like, tonally, you can kind of see it, but there is a very big difference between Neverland Nightmares and something like the Black Phone, because we really do deep dive into the Peter Pan character. We peel back some layers, and there are times where we're just with Peter Pan, kind of, getting into that the psyche, what makes him tick. There's a lovely scene in here that obviously we're not going into spoilers, but kind of has hints of supernatural, but you kind of realize what is the driving force of the supernatural feel to it. And I absolutely love that, especially being able to see that final cut of it in the editing there. It really does tap into some horror DNA, and I absolutely loved it.
Yeah, and I think that's another big piece of this pie that needs to work in order for this thing to be as satisfying as I found it to be is the casting. And I think that Martin Portlock absolutely crushes it as Peter Pan. I'm excited to see Peter Pan come back because he is, at the end of the day, a very dark character, like we've been saying. And I think that's, again, something people need to prepare themselves for, because there are sequences in this, especially one involving, I'll just say, a house, that it gets really dark. It gets really much closer to something like, and these are going to be very extreme examples, but when talking with Scott, this is kind of where he was pulling that imagery from, but something much more in kin with like a Martyrs and an Inside, rather opposed to the fun slashery nature of like a Winnie the Pooh. The kills in this movie are not fun. Like to say, I guess that's the best way to put it. They're not trying to be cutesy and like slashery and like harken back to the 80s. They're going for more of like that kind of French extremity kind of stuff where it's like, we're showing you a man slicing somebody up, and it's not cute. It's not pretty. It's very, very in your face. And that is another thing that I know some people may be like, oh, well, I want the, goofiness, the 80s of it. But I think it also plays really well in here because this character is very different than Pooh and his friends, and it's supposed to be. And I think that's cool that they're going to keep that kind of momentum going with each of these projects, where we're going to get a little different flavor with each installment. And this one just so happens to be one of the darkest, if not the darkest, that they're planning to do.
Yeah, I like the variation in tone, I guess. It's like going trick-or-treating and opening up your trick-or-treat bag at the end of the night and, having a variation of different candies that you can choose from for whatever mood you're in. And I love that trajectory that they're taking us here, where you can have fun with Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey, especially that second that sequel, and then you kind of go into Peter Pan. You want something a little darker, and we see what's on the horizon. I'm really intrigued to see what they're going to bring in terms of tone, because this one is very dark, like we said. And I love, you talked about, some of the kills in here. They don't shy away from the gore in the slightest here, but one of the things I commend Scott on doing is he really found a great balance between a lot of the gore and that kind of those kills and the tension that we bring to it, where we do sit in those scenes. It's nothing, there's sometimes there's a fast kill, and then we're on to the next thing. But there's a scene you're talking about inside a house, and man, it is relentless, where it's like we're going through, there's so much tension. It's so beautifully horrific from the ground that they cover. There's a kill in here that's, boy, I wish I could talk about it, but it's kind of like a character's already dying, and then it's like, hey, we're gonna do something else to you as well, and it's like, oh my gosh. And we really do lean into the darkness of Peter Pan. It absolutely works. This one, I had a lot of fun with Blood and Honey Part 2. I'll say Neverland Nightmares gives you goosebumps because it is chilling.
Yes, and I can say with certainty that, like, again, kind of just because I breezed over it, the performance from Martin Portlock as Peter Pan is exciting, and it does get me looking forward to seeing his character come back. And I think that all in all, the major pieces that need to work for this are what make this probably my favorite of the three films. Without a doubt, both of the other ones are much better than the first Blood and Honey, like by 10 miles. But this one, comparing it to Blood and Honey too, I would say just like on the whole, this just feels like, there's like Blood and Honey 2 has that issue of like, well, we have to kind of course correct, and we have to show people, we have to really win people over and get people to take it more seriously. This one doesn't feel like that anymore. This feels like, okay, we're confident, we're already set into the world, and now we're just going to focus on making this dark, creepy, like I said, semi-grounded story about a man who believes he's Peter Pan murdering children, and it's dark as fuck.
Yes, absolutely. And a lot of people weren't happy with that first installment of Blood and Honey, and then you kind of, out of blatant curiosity, I think you ended up winning over some of the negative audience, because they just wanted to go see what kind of dumpster fire Blood and Honey 2 was going to be, and it turned out to be, really well done comparatively to that first film. And I think it got some people on board. But, I think there's still a large majority out there that have an issue with this kind of public domain horror and taking, these stories from Disney stories or just stories from, children's stories and kind of implementing a lot of horror into it. But, I think when you look at something like Neverland Nightmares and, like you said, that sequel to Blood and Honey was kind of combative from that first one because you had to win an audience back. You had to prove yourself, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Neverland Nightmares, if Blood and Honey's not for you, and like we said, this tonally feels so different, absolutely give this a chance. When we talk about public domain horror, and a lot of people eye roll at that and say it's not going to be well done, it's a cash grab, it's an established lore, I'm going to point him toward Neverland Nightmares and say
I will too. Yeah,
this is a perfect, taking that lore and intertwining it with a modern horror story, making it feel organic, and really putting your own creative stamp on here with a lot of the gore and the tension that is in here. I think this is a blueprint of how it should be done.
Agreed. And I think like one of the best examples and one of the biggest things I can give to anybody about this movie is like, if you take, Peter Pan and just the sprucing and the little bit of Peter Pan lore and things they put into this out, you still have a very compelling dark slasher. I guess not a slasher, but more of like a psychological serial killer film. And that's a very big feat that I would say the Peter Pan stuff is really just kind of the icing on the cake for me. It's like I really enjoyed that. Now, is the film overall like this perfect masterpiece? No, I definitely think that there are some elements that you can tell there was budget restrictions. I think like especially we spend a lot of time in the third act kind of in a place and it is a lot of going back and forth from a couple different rooms, which, you know, it's budgetary. You have to kind of get there, so it does kind of feel a little like, okay, we're kind of extending our
It gets a
stay
little
here.
redundant sometimes, kind of going back
Yeah.
and forth.
And you know, I think that Megan Platico, sorry, I can't didn't pronounce her name right, but the woman they have playing Wendy Darling, she's good in a majority of the scenes. I think there's a couple of moments where it felt a little bit more wooden, and I couldn't tell if that was just like the writing or if it was necessarily her performance on that. It was just a lot of the expositionary stuff. She didn't feel like she was I wasn't as buying her performance as much, but I would say that when she's up against like Martin Portlock, and then another actress who I absolutely adored was Kit Green as Tinkerbell, which I gotta say, for those who didn't watch the video, I was very big I guess a detractor from the idea that they pitched for Tinkerbell, where it was that she's going to be some drug addicted fairy who does heroin and stuff throughout the movie. I'm like, this feels goofy. This feels like Family Guy humor. Like, this just isn't what I think this movie should go for when it comes to adapting certain characters. That is a character who completely 180'd it for me. Like, when you see how they handle Tinkerbell in this story and the kind of psychological depth that they bring to the character, it's one of, if not my favorite aspect of this film.
Yeah, and that idea of that character that, if you're using the original Blood and Honey as a reference point, I think you would be hesitant to see what the approach is going to be. But when you understand the tone here and how grounded, how dark they're going to go, that idea with Tinkerbell works perfectly because it does feel organic. Again, we're intertwining that Peter Pan lore, so it's just kind of an interesting way to do it, but then also such a very real issue in terms of society and what is going on. So I think it was a smart play, especially when you look at the approach. And that's what it really goes back to, is that approach. And clearly Scott had a vision for what that on screen was going to look like. And I think he pulled it off rather well. And like you said, I mean, performance wise, I think there's a cast that works well. So, when you're dealing with child actors and nothing overly bad, it's just, you have to take the good with the bad with it. There's some scenes that it didn't really necessarily hit for me, but overall, when we are asking for child actors to do this or to do that, especially with the subject matter that we're going with, I'll give them a little bit of leeway on that, because some of the stuff does get rather dark, and some of the situations that they're in are really hard to, act your way out of. So, that aspect of it, you got to take the good with the bad. I wasn't asking for too much. And then, yes, you do look at those budget constraints, and there are some places where I do see those. We had a note, and some things got changed around, but for me, it was better, but it didn't necessarily hit for me. I did have a couple criticisms. I'm not going to go into it because would be more of a spoiler.
We'll save it for the spoiler talk. We'll definitely do one.
Yeah. So for me, there were a couple of issues, but nothing too bad actually for this one, where it's like, yeah, we have budget constraints, but when we're in those scenes with high tension, we're in the house a lot of the time. I was really surprised about, the production value and how much mileage we got out of it.
Yeah, and I think that for people who are such big Peter Pan fans, there might be a couple of things that they do that it's going to be love it or hate it, and I think that budget comes into that as well. Scott had mentioned in our interview that there were things they wanted to do, but they couldn't, just because it's like, well, if I'm going to give you something that you recognize from that, I want to make that a set piece, and I want to make that something bigger when I can do it. And I think that that's a very mature, very understandable approach, because if he's going to do something, say the alligator or the crocodile, it's you don't want to just give somebody a bad CGI crappy crocodile. You want to put your best foot forward there. So if you are expecting a lot of big swings out of the Peter Pan universe, you're probably not going to get that. Like I said, go into this expecting it to be like an origin story, and like you're watching the birth, or at least the infamy of a notorious, now dark serial killer born into this universe. And I think that you'll see the kind of take that they're going for, and I think that's where my heart sits with it. I still think this is probably my favorite of the three right now. Recency bias could play into it, but at the end of the day, I think the most positive thing I could say is if you take away the Peter Pan stuff, you take away the public domain horror stuff, it's still a very compelling serial killer story that I definitely enjoyed. So I'm going to give Peter Pan Neverland Nightmares a solid recommend. I think you should certainly go out and see it this upcoming week. This is going to be hitting theaters definitely near us, and I think everywhere on the 13th, 14th, and 15th. So definitely go out there and see it. I'm giving it a solid recommend.
Yes, and I'm right there with you. This is an easy recommend for me as well. I was excited when this got announced to see what this was going to look like. Scott Chambers certainly did not disappoint here. I love the take and where they're going to go with this story. You know, I know we've talked about it. Some people have had issues with Blood and Honey, but if you have, I plead, go out and check out Neverland Nightmares. It's just, it's such a unique take. It's something so different. You know, leave what you know about Blood and Honey at the door and really give this an honest viewing. You know, we're friends with Scott, but I would be giving this a recommend either way because, I mean, you really see the attempt here, and he did pull it off rather well considering how small the budget is and, you know, the negativity surrounding public domain horror. You know, I think he did it in such an authentic way. I love the Peter Pan character. I'm excited to see what we're working toward with the whole universe and, you know, seeing Peter Pan back on screen at some point. A lot of great gore. There's a lot of positivity here. And I got to say, I think Scott Chambers created a new face of fear with this Peter Pan. I love the take.
I do too. And that's the biggest thing for me as well. It's just like, it's exciting to see such a strong start for a character that, you know, I think a lot of people were positive about the idea of a Peter Pan horror movie because Peter Pan is inherently a kind of a creepy idea. But to see it actually be attempted so much more grounded and so much more, like I said, in the tone of like a Black Phone, or even, like I said, with some of the gore, more like a Martyrs and an Inside, where it's like, it's not being fun. It's being frightening. It's being like, hey, this is serious. This is not a jokey kind of, we're having a big bear walk around with a bear trap and rip people's heads off. As much as I love that and had fun with it, there is a lot to love here for people who really like dark horror. So I think this is a total win. Definitely go out and see this one, guys. It's going to be a lot of fun. And yeah, we're going to do a spoiler one, whether it's just Luke and myself, but I'm sure I can get a couple of the boys in here to talk about it. Just because I think that there's a lot of stuff that we're going to have to get into. We want to talk about what got changed from the versions we saw, especially now, because Luke and I actually didn't talk about this before, but I'm very curious to see what he thought of some of the changes. So, you know, I think that it's pretty cool. So, alrighty, guys, but I think that's going to wrap us up here for this. Again, Peter Pan Neverland Nightmares is coming out next week. So that is January 13th, 14th, and 15th. Tickets are on sale and available now. I have ticket links in the description. So if we just sold you on it, go ahead and get the tickets. Check it out. It's going to be a lot of fun. My wife and I will certainly be there on one of the days. So yeah, it's going to be a good time. Oh yeah, and new intro. Yep, we got a new intro going on. So yeah, let me know what you thought of that, as well as what you thought about Peter Pan Neverland Nightmares. But yeah, that's going to wrap us up here. So until next time, I'm Dylan Newell.
And I'm Luke Janesco.
And remember, stay scared.
Do the horror shit, gonna do it live. Cause Splattercast kick it every day they live. Splattercast, gonna slash your ass. 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 Splattercast, gonna slash your ass.